A promise, I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome to today's video where we are looking at what we call the introduction to the digestive system. If it is your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe. You put on the notification bell so that whenever I load the video, you become the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the introduction to the digestive system. So now, during the study of the digestive system, we are going to be following this kind of the objectives, the definition, the components, and even also what we call the functions of the digestive system. Now, we need to first understand what is digestive system. But the digestive system is going to be that system of the body having a couple or network of organs that work hand in hand to make sure that they break down large food particles into tiny food particles that can be absorbed into the blood and even to the lymphatics for the purpose of tissue growth, also what we call tissue repair, and even also running other physiological processes. So now, all those kind of the processes are going to be under the influence of the digestive system. In other words, the digestive system is that system of the body that breaks down large food complex substances into tiny substances that can get absorbed into the blood system for the processes of tissue growth, tissue repair, and even running other physiological processes. So now, that is an ideal definition of what we call the digestive system. Now, the digestive system is made up of two main components, okay? What are these two main components? The first component of the digestive system is what we call the alimentary canal, okay? Is what we call the alimentary canal, okay? What we call alimentary canal. You may find some other people calling it the gastrointestinal tract, okay? You may find some other people calling it the what we call the gastrointestinal tract, okay, which very many people call the GIT, okay, which very many people call the GIT. So now we need to first understand what are those structures that are categorized under what we call the alimentary canal, because the alimentary canal is going to be that kind of the tube that is going to be providing an environment where digestion is going to be taking place, okay? So now it's going to be starting all the way from the mouth down up to the stomach, meaning that the gastrointestinal tract, or what we are calling the alimentary canal, is going to be opening on both sides, okay? It's going to be opening on the mouth and going to be opening at the anus. So now, let's go ahead and see critically what are those structures that really make the alimentary canal. The first one is going to be the mouth, okay? The first component of what we call the alimentary canal is going to be what we call the mouth, okay? And of course, the mouth is going to be having different other structures, which we are going to be seeing later in other components of the digestive system, okay? And of course, the mouth is going to be aiding in what we call the ingestion process, the intake of what we call the food, okay? Then the second part of the alimentary canal is what we call the pharynx, at the back of the oral cavity, okay? Is what we call the pharynx, okay? What we call the pharynx. And of course, the pharynx is going to be aiding in the swallowing process, okay? The down movement of the food into the what we call the stomach, okay? And then the third component of the alimentary canal is what we call the esophagus, okay? Is what we call the esophagus, okay? And of course, the esophagus is going to be that kind of the tube-like structure measuring approximately around 25 centimeters that aids in the down movement of the food into the stomach, okay? And then the fourth component of the alimentary canal is what we call the stomach. Okay, what we call the stomach, and of course the stomach is going to be that gel-like structure that's going to be housing the food temporarily for the proper digestion, chemical digestion, and even what we call mechanical digestion, such that we make what we call a semi-liquid substance, which we call the chyme, that moves to another portion of the alimentary canal, which we call the intestine, mainly what we call the small intestine. Okay. And then the fourth component with the alimentary canal is going to be what we call the small intestine. Okay, what we call the small intestines. And of course, when we talk about the small intestine, you're going to be having the first one, which we call the duodenum, the second one, which we call the jejunum, and then the last one, which we call the ileum. Okay, those are the three parts that make up what we call the small intestine. Okay, and then also the fifth one, this was the fifth one. And then the sixth one is what we call the large intestine. Okay, what we call the large intestine. And of course, the large intestine is going to be very, very, very much important, and it's going to be having a couple of other structures. It's going to be having what we call the cecum, okay, which is the dilated structure at the beginning of what we call the connection between the ileum and then the cecum. Then we have what we call the ascending colon, we have what we call the transverse colon, we have what we call the descending colon, we have what we call the sigmoid colon, we have what we call the rectum, and even also what we call the rectum. Okay, so now all those structures, they make what we call the large intestine. Okay, and then of course the seventh part, the last one, which is what we call the anus. Okay, which we call the anus. And of course, the anus is going to be the last part of what we call the alimentary canal. It is that exit point that allows the expulsion of what we call the fecal matter. Okay, so now these parts here generally make what we call the alimentary canal. So let's go ahead and see another second component of the digestive system. So now this one was the first component of the digestive system, and then we are going to look at what we call the second component. We're going to be looking at now the second component of the digestive system. Now, this second component of the digestive system is what we call the accessory, digestive. Okay, accessory digestive structures. Okay, accessory digestive structures. Okay, and of course, when we're talking about this second section of what we call the accessory digestive structures, these are the structures of the digestive system that aids in smoothing the process of digestion. Okay, in other words, during when we are studying about the accessory digestive structure, this structure or these organs, they are going to be aiding in the process of what we call digestion. They are helping, okay? They are helping the process of digestion to occur very well in what we call the alimentary canal, okay? Now, we are going to be finding that in these accessory structures, some of them, food is not going to be in contact with them, but some of them we are going to be having, some of them are having or getting in contact with what we call or some of these structures. So now, let's go ahead and see what are those structures that really make the accessory digestive organs. Now, in the mouth, the first one have what to call, in the mouth, we're going to be having also what some of the accessory digestive structures. What are those structures which are going to be part of the mouth? We have what we call the teeth. We have what we call the teeth, even have what we call the tongue. Okay, we have what we even call what we call the tongue. So now the accessory digestive structures within the mouth, we have what we call the teeth, which helps in what we call the mechanical digestion, even also what we call the tongue that aids in the mixing of what we call the food. Okay, and then also now the second part of the accessory digestive structure is what we call the salivary, the salivary glands. Okay, the salivary glands. And of course, the salivary glands are going to be having two kinds of the salivary glands. We have what we call the intrinsic and even also what we call the extrinsic salivary glands. And of course, we said that the intrinsic salivary glands, they are going to be producing saliva at a constant rate, while the extrinsic salivary glands are going to be producing saliva mainly following what we call a stimulus. We have what we call the parotid, we have what we call the submandible, and then the sublingual, all of them making what we call the extrinsic salivary gland. Super very important in production of saliva, which is going to be hydrating what we call the oral cavity. Okay, and then the third component of the accessory digestive structure is what we call the liver. Okay, and of course the liver is going to be one of the largest internal organ, one of the largest gland of the body, that's going to be primarily producing one of the most important chemical called the bile that aids in the modification of fats in the intestines. Okay, super very important and beautiful structure. Okay, and then the first component under the accessory digestive structures is what we call the gallbladder. Okay, is what we call the gallbladder. And this gallbladder is very important in the way that it is the one which is going to be storing and then concentrating what we call the bile. Okay, it is super very important and beautiful. And then the last part under the accessory digestive structures is what we call the pancreas. Okay, is what we call the pancreas. And of course, the pancreas is that kind of the leaf-like structure that is going to be aiding in the production of what we call pancreatic digestive juices that aids in the chemical digestion of different food nutrients within the small intestine. Okay, and then also that's for the case of what we call the exocrine role, but it also serves what we call the endocrine role by providing what we call insulin and even glucagon that aids in the regulation of what we call glucose. Okay, so now the pancreas is one of the most important accessory digestive structures that aids in the proper digestion within the intestines. Okay, it's also such another beautiful thing. So now these are the components that really make the accessory digestive structures. Okay, so now I'm having looked at now the components that make up the digestive system, the alimentary canal, the accessory digestive structures. Let's go ahead and look at the functions of the digestive system, because it is also worth to be known to know the functions of the digestive to know the functions of the digestive system. Okay, so now looking at the functions of the digestive system, looking at the functions of the digestive system, looking at the functions. Okay, functions of digestive, functions of the digestive system. Okay, functions of the digestive system. Now, the first function of the digestive system is what we call the uptake of food. And how do we call the uptake of the food? That is what we call ingestion. Okay, so now the first function of the digestive system is what we call ingestion. Okay, is what we call the ingestion, that is the uptake of food into the oral cavity. Okay, this digestive system has the ability to move the food throughout what we call the alimentary canal. And how do we call that? This function of the digestive system is what we call propulsion. Okay, and then the second function is what we call propulsion, or even some people may call it motility. Okay, some people may call it motility. And of course, it is within the digestive system where we are going to be having what we call the breakdown of the food, from large particles into the tiny particles that can be absorbed. And how do we call this process? Digestion. Okay, so now the digestive system also does what we call digestion. Okay, it does what we call digestion. And of course, when we talk about digestion here, we are going to be mainly focusing on what we call chemical digestion. Okay, chemical digestion, this one uses what we call enzymes. Okay, uses what we call enzymes, and even also what we call mechanical. Also what we call mechanical digestion. Here we're going to be using muscles. We're going to be using muscles and even what we call teeth to break down the food into tiny particles that can increase the surface area for enzymatic action. Okay, so now that's for the case of digestion. And then the first function is what we call absorption. Okay, absorption. Now, once the food has been digested chemically and then mechanically, it needs to be absorbed. So now the digestive system also absorbs the food in form of nutrients that can be utilized by the other body processes in the normal running of the human being. Okay, and then another function of the digestive system is what we call excretion. Okay, is what we call excretion. And of course, after the process of digestion has taken place, absorption has taken place, we need this kind of digestive system to excrete what we call the feces of the body, because it is super very important that the indigested food substances are eliminated of the body. Okay, and then the sixth function of the digestive system is what we call secretion. Okay, is what we call secretion. Now, the digestive system secretes a lot of substances. For example, saliva that is rich in immunoglobulin A that aids in immunity. We have what we call hydrochloric acid that gets secreted into the stomach that can also serve as a role of protecting against any kind of the microorganism that is eaten within what we call eaten along with what we call food. And even also some other juices that are going to be produced in aiding in the process of what we call digestion. So now, even also digestive system also helps in what we call secretion. Okay, and then mainly those are going to be the functions of what we call the digestive system. Okay, so now quick recap is going to be aiding in what we call ingestion, which is the uptake of food. Propulsion, that is the peristaltic movement of the food. It's going to be aiding what we call the digestion, which is chemical and then mechanical digestion. It's going to be aiding in what we call the absorption of the food. It's also going to be aiding in excretion of the waste products, and even also what we call secretion of different substances that aids in what we call protection, chemical digestion, and even what we call mechanical digestion. Okay, so now this briefly covers the introduction of what we call the digestive system. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please, you can support me. And that one can be done by a couple of means. You like the video, comment down in the comment section. You can share this video with someone else whom you think that this video is so much helpful. And of course, don't forget at the end of it all to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, as always, until we meet next time. Now, in the next video, we are going to be now looking at the diagrammatic illustration showing all the components of what we call the digestive system in a diagrammatic way. Tumnad as always.